Welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. In this episode, we are interviewing Sarah Ezrin, a yoga teacher and author, about how we can use yoga to support our pregnancy and preparation for birth, and what is lacking in the typical yoga class. Our conversation hopes to empower you in your prenatal yoga journey, as opposed to give you a list of things not to do. Rather, we hope that this podcast episode helps you to understand how to modify and when to modify, and to understand when a movement may or may not be optimal for you.
Welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. This is Gina, perinatal fitness trainer and birth doula.
And I'm Roxanne, labor and delivery nurse and student midwife.
And this is the MamasteFit podcast, where we empower you on your prenatal fitness, birth, and postpartum return to fitness journey.
Our podcast shares how to move throughout your pregnancy to stay strong and comfortable, because pain is not a requirement of pregnancy. Understand the science of birth and how to approach recovery after birth.
We share our personal experience as mothers navigating this stage in our lives, plus our professional expertise as birth workers and fitness professionals.
Our goal is to help you feel confident as you navigate the perinatal timeframe for an empowering pregnancy, positive birth, and postpartum journey.
We are glad to have you with us on this journey and that you have chosen us to support you. All right. Welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. We're really excited to have Sarah here. I've worked with Sarah to help her write a few blogs. And so I'm really excited to chat with you more all about prenatal yoga and how we can use yoga to prepare for birth and the things that you think are lacking in a prenatal yoga class.
Yeah, I am very honored to be here. Thank you for always letting me pick your brain. I send you emails from every article that I write. When I need an expert, I come to MamasteFit. And yeah, getting pregnant with my first son was, I think, my first realization, even being a senior yoga teacher, of what is really lacking in the yoga community. And it's not even just specifically prenatal yoga, but we can talk about just in general. And you know, people come into yoga to prepare their bodies for birth, but there's no mention of the pelvic floor in most of those classes. So just very grateful.
So can you introduce yourself to our listeners, for those that may not be familiar with you, just about your background and how you kind of came to be where you're at now?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Well, my name is Sarah Ezrin. I am a yoga educator. I've been teaching yoga for over 15 years. I've led trainings all around the world, workshops and retreats. But I've also been writing simultaneously, and I have had the high honor to write for different yoga publications and medical news like Healthline, which is what I like to quote you at. And then most recently, I wrote my first book, which I'm very excited about, called The Yoga of Parenting, which is a combination of the physical poses, psychology, yoga philosophy, interviews, and just put it all together into this little basket to help support parents, because as we know, it takes a village to raise a parent.
Yes.
So the number one recommendation that I usually see for fitness during pregnancy is to do prenatal yoga, join a prenatal yoga class. In our area specifically, there's just not a lot of resources for prenatal yoga. It's such a specific demographic that class is trying to serve. And there's just, even though there's tons of pregnant people in our area, there's just no pregnant or prenatal yoga class available to us. Did you have a prenatal yoga class that you did during your pregnancy, or was that something that you were teaching prior to pregnancy, or was that something that you started to incorporate after you gave birth?
Well, full disclosure, I was leading 200-hour trainings 6 years into my teaching career. I was already being tasked to lead 200 hours, which now looking back, I'm like, no, why did they give me the keys to the car? It's like when I see 16-year-olds driving and I'm like, no. But as part of that, as part of the core curriculum, we would teach a prenatal segment. And, you know, I memorized the manuals. I'm trained under a phenomenal teacher, but I had not had the experience in my own body. And, you know, even as I got older, older, air quotes, but even as I taught for more years and I had injuries and my body changed and I had way more people coming in and out of my room, I think I was still really bogged down in the rules that I had learned as opposed to the nuances of what really is pregnancy. And then I got pregnant with my first and I was like, whoa, like this is totally different than, it's not totally different than what we've been taught, but so much of what I thought I knew, I didn't know. And so I did go to a prenatal class. I was actually very blessed I'm in San Francisco, and I got to go to Jane Austen, who is, one of the premier prenatal teachers. But and Jane will be the first to tell you this too, the challenge with many prenatal classes is that it's a catch-all for people from their, 4 weeks when they first find out until they're 4 days late from their, estimated due date. And I think that can be hard to cater to everybody when everybody's in such different phases. And then pregnancy itself is so unique to each person. So, I mean, the thing that I learned, it's funny, I was just talking to someone the other day and they're like, how have your classes changed, since you've become a mom? And I'm like, whenever I have someone pregnant in my class, I like literally am like, I don't know. I'm like, just listen to your body. I don't know. I send them to you guys. Like, and I'm not just saying that. I'm like, just follow MamasteFit. Like, I'm happy to look at something, but like only if something doesn't feel good or if something does feel good. And it's just so different, right? It's so different person to person and pregnancy to pregnancy.
Was there anything during your pregnancy that you recognized was maybe inaccurate from the training that you were giving? Were you like, oh no, like I've made a mistake? Or was everything pretty in line with what your training was? And then you realized that there was more that you should have been teaching others or that you could have incorporated into your own prenatal yoga practice?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, I definitely, I don't know if I like made a mistake, but I'm all about owning my mistakes because there's many things I taught that I'm like, will not teach to save my life, or poses that I used to do. With the prenatal stuff, I think that what I found was that I was handed a lot of don'ts. I was handed a list of modifications as opposed to what are the poses that are going to empower. And of course, it's different, right? In my circumstance, I'm not a prenatal yoga teacher. I teach level 2-3 vinyasa. I was teaching very strong flows. So my job was to keep people safe. But I didn't, I only had, well, here's how you modify, as opposed to, well, this is what you should also be working on at home. That was a big thing. I mean, definitely the whole conversation around the core. What is the core? And I've interviewed you for many different core articles because, what we think of, is just the 6-pack abdominals, but, really like what is core during pregnancy? And you absolutely should be doing diaphragmatic breath and supporting your core. It just, but I think we were all told it's such, as baby yoga teachers, like no core whatsoever, like no plank, no, no this, no that. But, it's so personal to you. And, you talked with me a lot about coning and all of that. So I think it was more like less about, the mistakes that I made. And again, I've made many in my yoga teacher career, but more about like getting empowered with the right information, or me being able to be comfortable to empower my students, if that makes sense. Because like for them to be like, okay, maybe this is what you should be checking for. But yeah, definitely around the core. And 1000%, like, and this is what I was talking to Roxanne about recently, the pelvic floor. Like there is no mention in my entire 200-hour manual, which is this thick. It's like a single page, and it talks about the pelvic floor as it's just one thing. But it's all these different layers of muscle and all these different muscles that contribute to it. I mean, like, I don't need to tell you, you guys are the experts. I learned from you. But like, why isn't this being taught? Why isn't anybody talking about this in a regular class? Why? So, I mean, there was so much of that. It was just like, and now my teaching is very different. I feel like even in a 2-3, I'm like, make them lay on the floor and breathe 360 breath.
I didn't know that I had a pelvic floor until I was pregnant and was 27. And somebody was like, are you thinking about your pelvic floor? And I was like,
exactly.
What do you mean? what do you, and I'm like,
what is that?
How have I gone this long not really understanding how important this like base of my core canister could be? And then I think about myself as a high school and collegiate athlete, and I'm like, I could have been so much better if I just understood the pelvic floor and how it supported all of my stabilization and would have prevented so many injuries. And I definitely agree that there are a lot of lists of don't do this, don't do that, this is a dangerous exercise, or this is the unsafe exercise to do. And those lists get very long for pregnancy.
Yep.
Don't jump, like don't run, don't twist, don't just exist. But do a prenatal yoga class, but don't do anything in that. Just exist in that class. The list of don'ts for pregnancy is really long. And it's hard because yes, a lot of those exercises at some point may or may not be optimal for you. I don't like doing like yes and no lists, even though people love those. Just tell me what not to do.
Yeah.
So rather, if someone can understand like what makes an exercise less optimal for them as an individual, I find that to be so much more empowering. So if I'm doing my vinyasa and I come into my plank pose and I'm experiencing a lot of coning where the center of my abdomen is pushing out a lot further than the rest of my core, one, I could recognize that this is a symptom of pressure mismanagement. So I'm not properly managing that pressure within my abdominal cavity. And then I can then think about ways that I could either engage my core a little bit more to prevent that coning. I can focus on how am I activating my pelvic floor with my core? Am I coordinating my breath to my movement? And then once I've kind of fixed my position and my breathing and I'm still experiencing that coning, okay, maybe I need to find a different shape for this pose. So it's going to look different, but I can still achieve the same sensation. And that's something that we talk a lot about with our fitness movements. We talk about with our yoga classes is don't focus on the shape, focus on the sensation that you're trying to seek. And so if we're still experiencing coning, which is a symptom that we don't want to be experiencing with our exercise, can we find a different modification that still creates the same sensation? And I do find that that is much more empowering for someone because it gives them the tools to know this movement is not serving me anymore. It's okay for me to let it go because there's a lot of other things that I can do as opposed to tell them, don't twist, don't do crunches, don't do these things. Because when we're not telling them what to do, and we're just telling them all the things to avoid without giving them any tools to know when should they start saying, I'm going to find a different movement, because that changes for everybody. Like we have folks that'll be doing pull-ups for a really long time during their pregnancies, or they'll be running and jumping for a long time without any symptoms. And then we have other folks that are in their first trimester that are modifying things because that feels best for them and their body. And so I definitely agree that there are a lot of like don'ts with fitness in general during pregnancy. And instead empowering someone to know when to modify and how to modify is definitely so much better than like just exist for your whole pregnancy, please.
I'm glad you brought up the twist thing too, because that's another one, right? That's like because there's so much twisting in yoga and it's such an important movement, right? And what I love about everything that you're saying, it's challenging for a teacher like me who's teaching a general class and then has a pregnant person coming in versus teaching a prenatal focused anything, right?
Yeah.
Where you can get much more specialized. But I love the idea of you're telling people what to look for and you're giving them markers along the way, like, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. And then if none of those things work, okay, now let's try putting the knees down. Okay, we're still coning, like now let's go to hands and knees. Okay, we're still coning, let's go to the wall or whatever. But it's like I was just talking to someone about child development and like empowering my toddler. And it is kind of the same thing, but it's like you're giving them the choices to figure out the answers for themselves. And you're arming them with what are the things that we need to be looking for. And it's the same thing, with all those catch-all statements with twists too. I mean, it's twisting in different directions. And I almost wish, and I'm curious both of your thoughts, like when you have a prenatal class, like a prenatal yoga class or a prenatal fitness class, would it be beneficial? And maybe you do this already at MamasteFit where it's like divided by trimesters, or is it just everyone's pregnancy is just so unique?
Most folks' pregnancies are pretty unique. We have like general time frames of like, okay, most folks are shifting to this modification within this month or so of pregnancy, but everyone's pregnancies can be so wildly different with how many babies they're carrying, like what number pregnancy it is, how many toddlers they got running around, like just what's going on with their own pregnancies. And even for myself, like my modifications within each of my pregnancies has been different. And they're different for Roxanne too. Yeah. And so how we kind of structure our classes is we have folks that are like the program is generalized for the trimester, and then we kind of give little shifts with each week based on what we normally see with our clientele. And so if I was teaching like a group fitness class where everyone was doing the same workout at the same time, or if I was doing like a yoga class, I have my yoga certification, but I do not teach classes. If I was teaching like everyone's doing everything at the same time, I would offer some modifications for postures that I know most folks are going to have to modify at some point. So I might be like, hey, if you're in your second trimester, when we're doing this movement, this may be a good modification for you to try. So if we were doing the deadlift, for example, okay, if you're in your first trimester, you could probably maintain your pre-pregnancy deadlift form, but we may want to slow the reps down and kind of honor if you're feeling really fatigued, if you're feeling pretty nauseous, you might need to lower the weights as well. For those of you that are in your second trimester, we may want to widen the stance to start making space for belly. So if you feel like your belly is pushing against your legs and it's uncomfortable for you, just widen your stance. So I'm giving them a cue to know, okay, if I'm feeling this probably means that I should shift to a modification that's going to feel better for me and my body. And then for those of you that are in your third trimester, we can omit the barbell altogether. If you feel it's no longer serving you, we can elevate the barbell onto some blocks so that you don't have to move it down all the way to the floor. Or we can transition to like a kettlebell or some bands. And so it is kind of a choose your adventure. And so once we start getting into the later trimesters, you start having to give more options because everyone's really different. And so that's how I would do a group fitness class, is I would give some offerings for each of their trimesters and explain why someone may want to do that variation instead. So they can kind of feel in their own bodies of, okay, yeah, my belly is really hitting my thighs every time I come down. It is kind of uncomfortable. Let me widen my stance and see if that feels better. And so if I was doing like down dog in a class, which I think most folks can kind of intuitively figure out what feels good for them and their bodies. And I don't think we give enough credit to intuition during pregnancy and just in life in general. Like, you'll kind of know what feels good for you. It's like, hey, for those of you in your first trimester, if you're feeling really nauseous and elevating the hips is just not serving you, let's maintain a tabletop position instead of elevating the hips, or you could explore to see how that feels good for you. For those of you in your second trimester, maybe we widen the stance if you feel like your belly is hitting your thighs or it's not as comfortable for you. And for those of you in your third trimester, let's put some blocks underneath the hands to kind of elevate the upper body a little bit with a wider stance and see how that feels. And so we can give some recommendations with each trimester. And coming back to the twisting thing, we do get a lot of questions about, I was told to never twist. Like, why is there so much rotational work within this programming? It's like our spine needs to twist and to rotate. Now, we're not doing like deep abdominal compression and trying to detox or whatever it is from the various yoga classes that I've done. We're detoxing the liver. I'm like, I think it's doing that by itself, but okay.
No, that's all. It's been debunked, but people still say it.
They're all like, I'm not detoxing anything, but thank you.
Detoxing your intestines, getting your bowels moving.
So don't try to crush your belly. Just rotate to what feels good. The thoracic spine needs to rotate. And typically if we're having that low back pain during pregnancy or even like the neck or shoulder pain, it's probably because we're not rotating enough in the thoracic spine. We're getting like stuck in positions. During pregnancy, we tend to favor a lot of that extension with movements, which I feel like is also very like heart openers and like these big chest openers during yoga practice were always like my favorite classes to do. But I was already stuck in that position. So I was like, well, in hindsight, that I should have been doing.
It felt good, but
I should have gone the other way instead. But yeah, like we need to twist our spines. Just don't try to crush your bellies, but move. And also when it comes to core work, which I think we're going to dive into next, like we do want to do core work during pregnancy. It's important for us to do core work. It's going to support your baby's position. It's going to support your comfort during your pregnancy. Everything is not always about preparing for birth. We also want to feel good in our body for the 9 to 10 months that we are pregnant. So it's just gonna be so much better for your body to do that core work. And so it's the type of core work that we can do is a lot of rotational work. Really engaging in the obliques can be really beneficial during pregnancy. So that's where all those twists and those rotations are coming. And when we rotate, we're also kind of shifting the pelvic position, which if we're having pelvic girdle pain, we probably need to kind of do some rotation work within the pelvis so that it sits in a better position to stabilize. So twist, huge fans of them. Don't try to crush your belly or detox. That detoxing is not a thing. I mean, it's a thing, but it's not a thing by twisting with as much compression as possible. So what are the things that you've always been kind of told to like not do for core work during pregnancy? And what do you feel like we're really missing the mark on when it comes to when you have somebody that comes into a general population yoga class that maybe is pregnant or maybe even like early postpartum, like first year postpartum? what do you think that we're missing in those classes that we can do to better support the perinatal timeframe?
Well, I just want to say real quick, because what you were saying about intuition, I mean, I don't know about you, but like even as an athlete, even as somebody that is moving my body all day and supposedly listening to my body and telling other people to listen to their body, it wasn't until my first pregnancy that I think I was really listening to my body. You know, I was able to like bypass, you know, I'm like struggling through something, or, you know, like no wonder I had to have shoulder surgery. And you know, so I do think that that's one of the beauties of this period, you know, when you're carrying is that you tap into a source of intuition that's always been there, but you have access to it in this really just clear way, right? Like it's like where everything that doesn't feel good feels like an emergency, whether it's because that candle smells horrible or because you're lying on your back.
Yeah.
Or, you know, like someone's too close of a talker, or this pose doesn't feel right. So I really want to honor that time and, you know, emphasize that like if for the people listening too, right? Like for the folks listening, like if something's not feeling right in your body, like to trust that, to really trust that, you know, not even like just during pregnancy, but all the way through that time. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's so important. You know, the thing with the core, and it's funny, you were talking about crushing the belly, like, you know, there's the obvious, like, you know, sit up, right? Crunch sit up. You know, any kind of, in yoga, we do a lot of knee to nose, knee to nose, knee to nose. And we generally avoid those. I mean, one of the overarching themes of the prenatal training I did is make room for baby, make room for baby. So, you know, you shouldn't ever kind of be smushing the baby. But what I learned in my pregnancies is like, I actually was still kind of sleeping on my tummy through most of one of my pregnancies, because that was the most comfortable position for me. I couldn't position my body in any other way. And now it's funny, because I just realized this as I'm saying this. He loves, this is my 15-month-old, where I like breastfeed on top of him. Like, I think that was him wanting to be like smushed. So, you know, I think that there's that. I'd love to break that down with you, is like, the knee to noses, the actual like compressing movements in a crunch position. And I think as far as postpartum goes, we're lacking profoundly in the yoga world and in most of the fitness world. And you know, there's a lot of attention on prenatal. Every fitness instructor who gets pregnant suddenly thinks they're a prenatal expert. People are out there churning out content.
We could have a whole conversation just on that.
and it's not backed up, right? So much of it is not science-based, or, you know, there's no training there. And then postpartum, it's like, you know, everyone thinks that 6-week, 8-week appointment means that they're good to go. And that's the end of it. But postpartum, I'm still, I don't know how you're feeling. Like, you know, yours is 9 months now, Gina, or however, how old is the little one?
She's 9 months now.
So, I mean, like, that's still pretty fresh. I'm 15 months and I'm like still telling people I'm postpartum, and they're like, congrats. And I'm like, well, he's walking. Like, how old is your baby? Like, he's walking. He's got a full set of teeth. But I think postpartum, it's forever. It's forever. So, yeah, I mean, but I would love to hear from both of your perspectives, the experts, is like the crunching movement specifically, because I think that knee to nose thing, that's huge in yoga.
Mm-hmm. I would say the typical movements that I would say are probably going to go pretty quickly for most people. And it's going to vary depending on, again, whether or not you're experiencing the coning or symptoms of issues. Is usually the abdominal flexion movements, so like the crunches, the sit-ups, anything where I'm trying to like engage the core in this like rounded position is probably not going to be great during pregnancy. So like our boat poses, the cheetah pose, the I can't think of other ones, but anything where like I'm pulling everything together and using those muscles to engage is probably not going to be great during pregnancy at a certain point. Usually at some point, like handstands may not be wonderful, but if you have a handstand practice and it feels really good for you, like I'm not opposed to them. I think there are other types of inversions that we can do that are, one, probably going to be a little bit safer, and then also going to serve a lot more of a purpose. And so like we're real big advocates for inversions to release various uterine ligaments. So like down dog is a really great variation. The forward leaning inversion or like puppy pose are also really great ways to release tension in the uterine ligament. But a handstand is very active and there's not going to be a lot of release that is happening because you have to maintain a lot of core engagement in order to maintain that position.
Core engagement.
So really the abdominal flexion type movements are going to be the ones that I would probably say are going to go at a certain point, and then it'll come into balance. So how stable does somebody feel in a posture? Because if we feel unstable or really unsteady in a posture, we're going to clench the pelvic floor as well. And so if I'm in my tree pose and I feel like I'm going to fall over, or even if I'm in like a warrior posture or crescent and I feel really unstable, I'm going to be clenching in my pelvic floor as a compensation pattern to stabilize. And so we want the pelvic floor to move as we breathe in various postures, especially if you're holding a posture for a few breaths or a prolonged period of time. I want my pelvic floor to move down as I inhale and stretch and lengthen, and then exhale to engage and lift up and in. And so there's a lot of like, never do Kegels. Kegels are horrible. And yeah, I would say like if I was going to sit at a stoplight and just clench my pelvic floor repeatedly, not my recommendation. Don't do that. But as a part of my pelvic floor's range of motion and movement, there is a portion where it does contract and engage, but it's not just like quick squeezes or I'm holding it the entire time. It's coordinated with my breath. So I'm inhaling to feel the length, and then I'm exhaling to lift up and in, which would be what I would define as a Kegel or a pelvic floor activation, depending on the word that you want to use is the lift up and in. But we're not trying to find like max lift, like with every single breath that I do, because it has to meet the demand. And so if I'm in a yoga class, which I would not be engaging my pelvic floor as much as if I was deadlifting 200 pounds, I'm doing body weight movements. I'm not finding my max pelvic floor length and pelvic floor engagement because that's not the demand that I'm doing. And so I would say it'd be like 75%. Like I'm finding length and I'm exhaling to lift up and in. And so, but if I feel unstable in my posture, I'm going to be clenching the whole time, and there's not going to be any lengthening happening in my pelvic floor. And that's going to lead to more issues because we have this really tight pelvic floor. And then a baby is like, how do I make my way through? Or we're going to have pelvic pain and issues because if the pelvic floor is not moving optimally, because usually we're going to have uneven tension, it's going to kind of torque the pelvis and it's going to misalign the pelvic joints. And so they're going to have a hard time stabilizing. And so this can be a big reason for pelvic pain is the pelvic floor has been clenching the entire time because we feel unstable in our postures. Now, I'm not saying like one yoga class a day, if you're in an unstable posture, your pelvic floor is going to be like, oh God, like, but if every single class you do, and then you kind of sustain those type of movement patterns in your day, then we might have some issues with the pelvic floor. And so if you are feeling unstable in your postures, find a variation that is more stable for you. And so instead of having the knee hovering in a crescent, if you feel like you're wobbling all over the place, bring the back knee down. And then we're still finding the sensation, but we're in a different shape. And so those would be kind of my like two main things for we're probably going to need to modify is you're probably not going to need to do lots of abdominal flexion movements. Like there's other ways to work our core, and we need to think beyond sit-ups and crunches as core work, which when I was like in high school and college, that's all I thought of core work. V-ups, sit-ups, crunches, bicycle, everything was like, I'm going to have six-pack abs, which are aesthetically pleasing. They're beautiful. They're not always functional. And the core is so much more than just our six-pack abs. We have our obliques, the transverse abdominis. The pelvic floor is a part of your core. Your back muscles are a part of your core. And so there's so much going on with the core that we need to think beyond sit-ups and crunches. Because we'll also have folks that are postpartum that are like, I need to get my body back, which, I mean, I hate that whole marketing scheme. I think it's very exploitive. Not expletive. It exploits people. It's not exploit. I could also curse about it.
Well, it is. It actually is expletive. Our reactions to it is like,
I hate that marketing strategy. Like the before and after pictures. I'm like, okay, like thank you. Especially when the before picture is somebody that's pregnant, and then the after picture is like postpartum. I'm like, so I did one that was the before and after as like a doula service joke where I was like, she's pregnant and now she's not because of a doula. Overnight results. But we need to get beyond crunches and sit-ups and all of these abdominal flexion movements, meaning core, because anything where I'm resisting movement is core work. So this is where like the planks are coming. If I am in a posture that I have to maintain my torso position, that's a core movement. Squats are core movements, deadlifts are core movements. And then we can start getting into the more rotational work. So if I'm doing some like upward chops or anything where I'm rotating my body, that's a core movement. Anything where I'm working my back muscles, that's a core movement. So everything that we do, we are stabilizing our spine and we're anchoring on it so that my arms and legs can do things. And so we need to just move beyond core, or what we define as it, and expand our horizons to know that literally everything I do, breathing is a core movement, which is great early postpartum. So move beyond core movements. Find some balance in your posture so you don't clench your pelvic floor the entire time.
I think what's challenging, I didn't really think about that, about the balance poses before, because, you just, it's the same thing where the pelvic floor is under taught and, you just like assume like, oh, you have a pelvic floor, like just figure it out. But the other thing in the yoga community is that there are styles of yoga, and I grew up in the Ashtanga system, which was all about bandhas, which are these internal locks, which, aren't necessarily physical spaces, but the root lock is really about lifting the perineum, and that you're instructed to do that in every single pose.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain sects of yoga where people are gripping through the whole thing, whether they're inhaling or not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, that I think that's really important too, is like, and maybe it's different when you're deadlifting and you have to move with your breath in a different way. I mean, you think, right? Because yoga, you're flowing on the breath, but like you would actually be able to let go. But I mean, and I don't know, Roxanne, maybe it was your experience too, in the like with on the ward when people were having babies. But I know with a lot of my yoga practitioner friends, that first baby was challenging because they had gripped for so long.
Yeah.
So whether it was like prolonged labor or tearing, which was what I had, there's a lot of that amongst my friends, and most of us we assume that it's because we were so tightly wound.
Yeah, no, it's not to like say like every person who does like a certain type of yoga,
of course,
like, comes in and has
Please.
issues.
Yeah,
but it is. I feel like I also did like a yoga teacher training and followed a ton of yoga influencers on Instagram, like when I was early 20s. And I found that a lot of them, that when they got pregnant, because I was a labor and delivery nurse, so I like loved following the ones that got pregnant through their entire pregnancy. A lot of them had really hard first labors, either leading to a C-section or like a severe tear, and like some of them had like beautiful, like easy births, and that's, happens. But a lot of them seem to like really struggle with like birth because their pelvic floors probably were just so tight that they weren't able to relax and open. And it's funny because like I would have these conversations with Gina and be like, I wonder if like yoga is like making birth harder for people in certain instances, especially if like certain posture.
I have a
like
theory.
certain influencers, like they're doing like really intense yoga daily,
It's the
multiple
hardcore,
times
yeah.
daily. So like their pelvic floors potentially were even more tight. But then it's also, yoga is very, like, I feel like heart opening. Like,
And hip opening.
it's very external rotation, heart opening. So internal rotation is really hard for a lot of, like, I feel like people that I mean, even me, like internal rotation is just hard because I did 5 years of yoga, like a 90-minute yoga class every day where I'm just like splaying my body
The
open.
yoga block between my shoulder blades.
Yeah. And I'm not really focusing on internal rotation, like hero pose. Like I would see people like lay back in hero pose and I'm like, that's not me. Internal rotation is just not me. Like I've had accepted that in a lot of people that I followed, and even like people who came in to birth, like my patients, if they did a lot of yoga, they'd be like, yeah, I hate hero pose. Hero pose sucks. Internal rotation, not easy in a lot of bodies.
This is my theory on why yoga, the typical yoga class, may be contributing towards labor stalls. And it's the same theory that I have for folks that do a lot of like CrossFit and power focused workouts. everything is so extension focused, heart opening focused, everything's so external rotation and hip opening. Because when we think hip opening, we're not thinking I'm bringing my knees in and I'm emphasizing internal rotation. Usually it's external rotation, wide knees, butterflies, deep squats, malasana, like pigeon pose. Everything is external, external, external. And then even when we're doing the yoga postures, like everything is very externally rotated, like the warrior poses, external rotation. And so there's not a lot of emphasis on the internal rotation. And this is the same for like normal fitness programs as well. Typically, we're lacking in the internal rotation aspect. And with the extension side, we're favoring that anterior pelvic tilt. So the pelvis is tilting forward as we're kind of arching in our backs all the time. If you think about it, crescent, we're like, goddess pose, like everything is, I'm here, I'm opening my heart to the experience, which is wonderful. It feels amazing, but it feels amazing because you're already really tight and short in there. And so when you do it, you feel more stretch and tension, and you're like, yes, this is exactly what I need, which is confusing when something's already really short or something's already really lengthened, and then you stretch it more, you have more sensation because you're like already at the max, and then you max it out even more, as opposed to the direction that is actually tight. You don't feel as much sensation, which is confusing. And you're like, but I feel it way more on the side of my body that is long. And so because we're favoring extension, it's hard to find that posterior pelvic tilt. So tucking the butt underneath. And you have to think about it, like so many yoga postures, and even for like lifts, like squats and deadlifts, everyone is like arching in their back. So if you think about the crescent, we're like, as much opening as possible. And if we cannot find that posterior pelvic, if we cannot release tension in the hip flexors to tuck the butt underneath, if we cannot release tension in the lats to tuck the butt underneath, baby cannot enter the pelvis. If you cannot find a posterior pelvic tilt, your baby cannot enter into your pelvis, unless it's a very small baby and you have a very large pelvis. But the sacral promontory pushes forward and it impedes baby's path unless you tuck your butt underneath. And that is a big reason why I think labors take a long time, because it takes for baby forever to finally get into the pelvis. Mm-hmm. And then as they're like, all right, I finally made it. She finally tucked her butt underneath. And here I go. And then they start to rotate and then they're stuck again because they cannot find internal rotation. So we've spent 9 months, an entire lifetime of yoga of wide knees. Everything's open. Everything's external rotation. Like I loved hip opener classes. Those are my favorite classes. I needed the opposite, though. I need the internal rotation class, the hip closing class. and I mean, it opens different parts of your pelvis. And so then we're always favoring this external rotation. And we can't open the lower half of the pelvis, which is going to open more with internal rotation. So now baby's getting stuck as they're like halfway through the pelvis. And then a posterior pelvic tilt makes internal rotation easier to find. And if we can't find that posterior pelvic tilt, like baby just managed to wiggle their way into the pelvis somehow. Now it's like, well, if I can't tuck my butt underneath to make internal rotation easier, I'm not creating enough space. So that's why I think folks that are in like power focused sports like CrossFit, where everything is extension, external rotation, like dance, yoga, everything where we're just in this posture, baby's going to have a hard time entering into the pelvis without being able to find that posterior pelvic tilt. And then baby's going to have a hard time finishing the rotation through the pelvis if we cannot find internal rotation. So those are like the two big things. And then when we're always favoring external rotation, the posterior half of the pelvic floor is very tight. And we need that to release so that we can find that internal rotation. Because it's kind of like a chicken versus an egg thing, where is my pelvis in this position because the muscles are really tight, or are my muscles really tight because my pelvis is in this position? And it's like, well, it's probably the muscles because those are what are changing the position of our skeleton. But yeah, so that's my
no, and I mean we've talked about it a lot over the past years of like why this trend seems to be there. Again, it's not everybody, but like there is like a higher trend. And I was like, it's because you go to a yoga class and the poses that the instructor normally likes is probably what they're going to sequence. Like I did not do a lot of Warrior One in my sequences because that's kind of a little bit more internal rotated and I did not like it. So I'm not going to sequence this into a class as often as I'm going to put Warrior Two. Like, I'm not going to put hero pose where you're going to hold it for a while, because I'm not going to hold hero pose for a while. So like classes are usually sequenced more with that external heart opening type class, because that's kind of what people want out of yoga too. So it's funny you mentioned that, because I have noticed this trend, and hopefully now that, like, I feel like pelvic floor is just talked about so much more. Like, it was not mentioned. I did a whole like 50-hour prenatal certification, and pelvic floor, I think, was mentioned only because the instructor was a PT. So she mentioned the pelvic floor being really important and how we need to be able to relax it, but like not really how to do that, or like how to cue that in a class, which is kind of a big deal. And then in like my actual 200-hour training, prenatal yoga, it's like, make sure it's not too hot, because you don't want your pregnant ladies to go down. Like, maybe just tell them, like, or it's like, do not do hot yoga during pregnancy. This is bad for you. When it's like, it's not necessarily again, everyone's an individual. Like, some people can do hot yoga forever. So I feel like now, maybe if we took like a prenatal class, like, it would be talked about a little bit more. But definitely like 2015, probably not really talked about very often or at all.
And a lot of those internal rotation poses, Virasana, eagle pose, all of those are taught that they're contraindicated during
like, you shouldn't be doing this during
because
pregnancy.
of the loose ligaments, right? And like, and when you do take most prenatal classes, I mean, I would hope that things have changed, but like, you know, I was taking prenatal classes recently for that article, not pregnant, but just testing stuff out, and it is still tons of malasana, tons of. That's how people are preparing the body for birth, but you don't think about that you actually need to be able to roll your inner thighs in and have that more space, you know, between the sit bones. That's like, and because those are the poses you're told not to do.
Yeah. And like the twist. So like oh my gosh, I can't even remember the name, but it's like the twist where you're opening towards the front leg. That is an internal rotation. And you're like, you can't even do that during pregnancy. So good luck with your internal rotation.
Yeah. I think it's time. I think you both are being called back to creating a yoga program.
We probably are. We already have people that copy our content now, but I'm like, well, I mean, it's not. You can give us credit, but you're still spreading the news to people that we don't reach, and so I'm not that mad. But I'm going to call you out.
I think like Casey, she has done like yoga modification type courses, because she's definitely like way more in the yoga realm than we are. She's like 500 hours certified teacher.
Yeah, but she's learned a lot from us too on the importance of internal rotation, and she was a big like belly breather with yoga as well, which we had conversations about it where she was like, I think that really contributed towards my lingering diastasis was every time I would take a breath, because I remember being cued in yoga classes.
Yeah, same.
Breathe into your belly, expand your belly, and I'm like, and in hindsight, I'm like, well, that's not diaphragmatic breathing. That's belly breathing, which isn't horrible, but it's not a good breathing strategy.
Yeah. We just need to make some postpartum and prenatal yoga content.
We should just make a yoga teacher's training course, I guess.
Casey.
I mean, and I didn't even realize that both of you had your certifications.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's definitely a need for it. And I think that's the beauty of this podcast, and that's the beauty of the content that you put out there. And I am actually seeing a change beyond prenatal, postnatal, where so many yoga teachers, you know, all of us were like diehard Ashtanga practitioners that like, you know, never used a prop, that now a lot of my friends are also trained in FRC, and their classes are like, forget about the handstand, like let's just practice being in chair and stepping one foot back, you know, which is like basically walking. So I am hopeful. I mean, I think it takes a long time to make big changes, but, you know, thanks to experts like you and the awareness that we're creating and the way that information's being disseminated, like I am hopeful, you know, that we're getting out there and, you know, you hear pelvic floor a lot more now. I was asked to teach a pelvic floor class for Shackley, which is a you know, supplement and wellness company. Like they reached out for a pelvic floor class, which is like, that. So I think it's in the vernacular. It's starting to be
definitely
more understood. But there's still big holes, right, that need to be filled in. And postpartum is like that. We didn't even really get into that, and I know we're running out of time, but postpartum's its own thing. Yeah.
So what recommendations do you have? Because we just talked about how yoga's horrible for you, I feel like, which it's not. It's wonderful.
No, I mean, I did yoga my whole pregnancy. I love yoga still, but
what would you tell to a yoga teacher or to a pregnant person that's about to walk into a yoga class? Like, okay, so we just talked about like the excessive heart openers and hip openers are maybe not preparing you for birth as well as we are hoping, but they feel really good. And so like, yeah, like you should do them. Like, don't omit them from your practice. But what would you recommend to the teacher or to the student to start to incorporate more of the rounding and the back flexion and like internal rotation within their yoga practice? Like what poses would you say, like, maybe think about incorporating this in addition to the malasana or the pigeon?
Yeah, I hope that this wasn't interpreted as me knocking yoga, because I love, yoga is that's my foundation.
Yeah,
that's what I stand upon. And also like, and I say this in the book too, is like yoga really is about connection. So like, when you're deadlifting, that can be yoga. When we're with our kids, that is its own form of yoga. So I think, just to be clear, like there are certain poses and certain, approaches that, and I also still love Ashtanga. I just, it's like not good for my body. So anyway, that's my disclaimer. I still love yoga. And yeah, I mean, at least what I do now, not pregnant, so I don't have relaxin, right, is I do work a lot more of Virasana, Supta Virasana. So that's, the hero's pose for people that don't know, where your knees are together, your feet are apart, you're sitting in between your ankles, sometimes on a block. I need support I can't sit directly on the floor. And then you can back up, right? You can go backwards. But that's also internal rotation, like lengthening the internal rotators. I like it, a lot of the poses where we're trying to strengthen the internal rotators too. So something like eagle pose where you're more active, where you come from chair and you wrap your legs. And that's another interesting one, is that for so long I was told no eagle during pregnancy, no eagle during pregnancy. And so I didn't do it with my first, but with my second, I felt like my body needed that. It actually... And again, it's this idea of like, you don't want to be like compressing baby, but by crossing, I'll sit cross-legged. No one tells you can't sit cross-legged, right? It's like, it's the same thing. And if I'm actively internally rotating, I'm actually creating more space at the back of the pelvis.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge fan of those. Like I said, and I'm not even kidding, like I will spend like 20 minutes just in chair and like stepping back to crescent and then back into chair, because even that, in order to maintain, the front outer hip and tracking the knee over the ankle, you're still working. You're working your abductors on the outer hip, and then you're stepping way back, right? Like, which is like you have to work the internal rotators to keep your back leg and hip straight, or straight. There's no such thing in the body. So I think a lot of that kind of work is super beneficial, and just getting really curious. And even just with the arms, right? Positioning with the arms too. Because when the baby comes out and again, I know we're like running out of time, but when the baby comes out, you are rounded forward a lot, right? You're holding the baby, especially if you choose to breastfeed. So I think it's important to learn, how do you have your arms forward, but at the same time work to roll the shoulders open. So the arms will be in an internal position, whether it's like hands behind the back, in like that reverse prayer, which I don't even do anymore since my shoulder injury, but like even your hands on your hips, how do you practice having the position of the arm bone turned in, but also then being able to create a little bit more openness in the chest? So I think it's just like getting really curious and not just doing side angle pose. My sister literally she hates side angle pose now. Because she like is who got me into yoga, like seriously into it. And she like boycotts. She's like, why does every teacher have to teach this pose? She just won't do it. She'll just do Warrior One instead. So, I think it's just like getting curious. Yeah, she does. She's just like, I'm just going to do my own thing. She doesn't care. And it's, I get it because she's already so turned out and she doesn't need any more external rotation. So I think it's just getting curious. But those are my faves. Those are my go-tos, the seated heroes, eagle pose for an active one, and even just simply stepping forward and back.
I mean, I'm definitely a fan of yoga too. I don't have an active practice in it, but I think whatever resonates with you for your fitness during your pregnancy, you should feel empowered to do it. But we might need to add in a little bit more to make sure that we're getting like a well-rounded practice. It's not just all heart openers and hip openers. We're also finding that internal rotation. And we can incorporate that as we are moving through our postures as well. Like with that revolved lunge, like just trying to think like rotating the pelvis on the femur in these more active poses to find internal rotation can be super beneficial. Like think about, am I tucking my butt underneath in certain postures to lengthen in my hip flexor like crescent instead of falling forward? Maybe I'm tucking the butt underneath a little bit more, releasing that hip flexors as I find more of that posterior pelvic tilt. So there's definitely some modifications and little pieces of magic that we can kind of incorporate to ensure that we have that well-rounded yoga practice, and the same thing for like lifting and stuff. So before we finish, I would like you to talk about your book and what people can learn in it, and then also where folks can find you and learn more from you if they wanted to take a class with you.
Oh, well, thank you. There's a garbage truck outside, so just head up if you're and a snoring dog. This is what the book is about. The book is like, how do you find yoga when all of this is happening? But spinal flexion too, right? Of course, like cat's breath and all that, like adding that into my top choices of important movements, because in especially when pregnant, it feels really good. But yes, my book, thank you, is The Yoga of Parenting. It just came out through Shambhala Publications in June. And it is all about taking all of the work off of the mat and into your family. So a lot of the awareness pieces that we were talking about, the intuition pieces, so much of what we learn in our physical body. And, I mean, I dare to say that, we're similar because we love the body because, getting into the biomechanics and getting into all that, that's a form of mindfulness. Like that's meditation in of itself. Learning how to tune into the bones to, figure out which muscle you want to engage. So how can we take that minutia and that deep dive of the physical poses and translate it into our parenting? So like, for example, you mentioned tree pose, standing on one leg, which, we can be fascinated about, like, how are we balancing, but also how is tree pose affecting our nervous system? What does our body do when we're in tree pose? Well, guess what? It's the same thing that happens when your toddler is screaming at you. It's the exact same reaction, that fight or flight response. And if we can get comfortable in our body, then we can start to be more comfortable in these circumstances off of the mat. So like I said in the beginning, it's just like a blend of concepts, different yoga philosophy concepts, like the idea of boundaries or breath or energy management. And then it's all tied together through a pose, through different stories from different parents I got to interview, through backed up modern research, because so much of the brain research today in neuroscience is like backing up what yogis have been claiming for, thousands of years. And just these different ways for us to learn about ourselves so that when we are in those heightened circumstances, we can find grounding, we can stay connected to ourselves and our kids. And most importantly, we can have compassion for ourselves for being the very human parent that we are.
Where can our listeners find you and learn more from you?
So I'm probably most active on IG these days, but it's always changing now that we have like new apps to play with in general. So many apps, so I cannot keep up. But I was like, I had to check my LinkedIn and then my Threads and then my TikTok. And so, but my name is Sarah Ezrin, and Sarah Ezrin Yoga is my direct website. And I am on IG and TikTok and all those things. And, just reach out at any place, ask all the questions. I love connecting to people.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us and chatting all about yoga, the pieces that might be missing from your practice as you're preparing for your birth. And it was a really fun conversation. And thank you for always reaching out to me whenever you need any help with your blogs. It's always really fun to chat about it.
Thank you. I love it. I love geeking out with you guys and like just getting to chat about it, because I don't really get to talk about it with people in the same way. I'm not leading trainings right now. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to write an article and then ask Gina really detailed questions about the different layers of the core. And then we could go back and forth. So I appreciate it.
I'm here to support you as you are here to support others as well.
Yeah. Well, you two support so many people. And, I found you all because I was leading an online teacher training and was like trying to find, and was during COVID, and I was trying to find resources that we were doing everything on video and virtually. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, this is my people. So I'm just so grateful for both of you and all that you put out in the world, and for the whole Mamaste community and all of your teachers and just everything you're putting out there.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, it was wonderful chatting with you, Sarah. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kim, and I finished up the pre and postnatal certification by MamasteFit earlier this year, and I just wanted to say this was hands down the best course I've ever taken. I've taken my general certification, and it doesn't even compare to the level of detail and the amount of education and effort that went into this course. So I came out of it feeling extremely confident, really excited, and even built my own business to be able to coach pre and postnatal women. So I can't recommend it enough. Everyone is so nice. Gina is so quick to respond. And again, I highly recommend this course to anyone looking to become a coach for pre and postnatal women.
Thanks for joining us today and listening to this episode. If you want more support throughout your pregnancy, join our prenatal fitness programs and childbirth education course. If you need more support after birth, join our postpartum fitness programs and education courses. If you're a professional, we offer birth worker and fitness trainer courses so you can learn from us and earn CEUs. Explore all of our courses on our website at mamastefit.com and use code STORY10 to save 10% off all of our programs.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow our podcast to be notified when we release new episodes. Leave a review and share with all of your friends, literally everyone you know that is within the perinatal timeframe. We release new episodes every Wednesday.
This podcast is sponsored by Needed, a nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment for your perinatal journey, and Crossover Symmetry, world-class training and equipment for pain, fitness, and performance.
Use code MamastePod for 20% off your first Needed order, and code MamasteFit for 20% off your Crossover Symmetry shoulder system.